Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the 11th Morung lecture. We bring this lecture to you after a long haul, as many months have gone by in waves. And as you all know, because of the political situation, we could not mobilize more people to attend the lecture, but we are very grateful that a lot of you have come from many far distances. Thank you very much for coming to it. So just to rejig everyone's memory, the Morung lectures have been designed by the Morung Express as a string of narrative events that promote dialogue over difficult issues in society. As many of you know better, Naga society has embarked on a process of reconciliation, not with an external entity but within itself, through the healing of wounds and broken relationships in the society. Forgiveness and politics around it take a new dimension in this context. To help us understand this, we have a distinguished speaker in the body of Dr. Kethoser, Kevichusa. Forgiveness and Politics, the title of today's lecture, is also the title of his recently published book, about which you can enlighten us later. Dr. Kevichusa is a speaker and trainer with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries Life Focus Society in Nagaland. Following his undergraduate degree in English literature, he studied theology, earning a BD from Union Biblical Seminary and an MTH from the University of Oxford. Pardon me. An MTH from the University of Oxford. Dr. Kevichusa earned a PhD from the Oxford Centre for Mission Studies and Middlesex University, London. His doctoral research focused on the philosophical and ethical relation between forgiveness and politics. While his research specialization is in the field of political ethics, Dr. Kevichusa's general areas of interest are theology, biblical studies, apologetics, politics, peace studies and ethics. He lives with his wife and 3 children in Nagaland now. We hope to be enlightened by his discourse today, so I welcome Dr. Kevichusa to the board.
Thank you, Haley, and I want to thank all of you for coming to this lecture. I actually dressed up before putting on this formal suit. And I was dressed up fairly casually, but then my wife came in, saw me and said, "It's a lecture." Put on a blazer. So I changed, and here I am, looking a little overdressed in your midst. It really is a privilege to be speaking to you and to be delivering this Morung lecture. I've attended at least one, and I know I benefited from it, and I also know that many people have benefited over the course of the lectures. Today's lecture is forgiveness and politics. I'm basically an armchair theorist as far as this topic is concerned. I'm not a peace activist I hope I forgive people. I am a forgiving person, hopefully, sometimes not as forgiving as I should be. But my intellectual journey into this whole topic began, in a sense, much before I was born. In 1956, my grandfather was killed by our Naga nationalists. And my grandfather was a medical doctor serving under the government, and he was working in Pek. And on his way, he was walking from Pek to Kohima. He was waylaid by assassins, and he was murdered, simply because he was an Indian government servant. He was the first medical doctor among the Lothas. I'm actually half Lotha. And the government has been very gracious to name the hospital in Woka after him. Then in 1992, my uncle, my father's younger brother, he was a state politician, not a successful one, but he was a state politician. He was assassinated right over there, or is it here? His name was Kevichusa. And I still remember, we were all fairly young. I remember during the funeral, my father, representing the whole family, he said that the family forgave the perpetrators and that the family did not harbor any intentions of revenge. He was killed by, again, one of our nationalist groups. We don't exactly know the reasons. Then, in 1996, another uncle, my father's second brother, he was again assassinated. 1996. He belonged to one of our political groups. And I remember the night before the funeral, I remember telling my dad, this time don't say anything about forgiveness. But my father said, my father is a very imperfect man with a lot of weaknesses and frailties. But that night he said something. He said, but what else can I do as a follower of Jesus? What else can I do? And he was crying and he was telling me that. So the next day, he again said that on behalf of the family, he said that the family again did not harbor intentions of revenge and that the family forgave the perpetrators. But with all that, declaration of forgiveness, it really did not make any difference politically. It has not, as far as I know, made any difference in politics, whether Naga national politics or Naga state politics. And I've always wondered whether forgiveness can really make a difference in politics. And so I decided to do a PhD on it. And I got a PhD on this whole topic and has become, if you like, an expert in forgiveness and politics. So what I want to do today is, well, I won't be reading out my PhD thesis, but I've really simplified, broken things down because of the format of this lecture. I want us to just explore this whole theme of forgiveness and politics and ask the question, can forgiveness and politics mix? And if so, how do they mix? Of course, there will be a lot of things that I will not be able to say in this lecture, and I hope you will forgive me. This lecture will proceed, as it were, in 3 steps. First, I want us to look at the whole concept of forgiveness. Then secondly, I want us to explore how forgiveness and politics mix, or how forgiveness can have political purchase or political impact or influence. And I will be giving examples here and there. Then thirdly, I want us to revisit the whole concept of politics, the whole idea of politics. And I want to argue by the end of the lecture that forgiveness and politics have a very intrinsic relationship. And that it is forgiveness that makes politics possible. And that without forgiveness, there can be no politics. So it's a very big argument or a big claim that I hope to sustain through this lecture, especially the third part of this lecture. So on with the first part. What is forgiveness? What is forgiveness? One of the best things to do in asking or in looking at a concept or studying something is not by asking what is it, but before that, prior to that, by asking what is it not. So let's ask that question. What is forgiveness not? First of all, forgiveness is not just an intrapersonal or a purely private thing. Many people, they make the mistake of thinking that forgiveness is something that happens entirely within you, that it's all about you. And there are top psychologists, pop psychologists, very popular psychologists who say that, who would go around saying, for example, Dr. Phil, he used to appear in Oprah Winfrey. He's a pop psychologist, highly respected. He says, forgiveness is all about you. It is something that happens entirely within you. Forgiveness is a gift that you give yourself. But we disagree with that. Because forgiveness always involves at least two people. At least a wrongdoer and a wronged. So at least it is interpersonal. And it is never just intrapersonal. Secondly, forgiveness is not the same as healing. Whether it is emotional, psychological, or physical, or even historical. It is not this, forgiveness is not the same as healing. And one of the reasons why we get confused or depressed or dejected, even in our own personal lives, or in the context of interpersonal relationships, or even in the context of political conflict, is we think we have not forgiven because we are not healed yet. But forgiveness is not the same as healing, and they have to be differentiated. I'm a Christian, and I believe most of us are. Almost all of us are Christians. It's very interesting that healing in the Bible, healing is promised only in the end. It is only in the end, in Revelation 21 and 22, that we are promised that God will wipe away all tears from our eyes. So healing is a promise. It is, in theological terms, it is an eschatological promise. A promise of the future, complete healing. So it is possible that you and I, we can forgive someone and still not be healed completely. And still be crying. And still be limping. Or every now and again resentment coming back. Or anger, even anger coming back. If I were to jump on you right now and then take a dagger and then stab you with a dagger. And you forgive me. And we take you to the hospital, and then from the hospital you declare forgiveness for Kethoser, Kevichusa, and you say it on Facebook or Instagram, with a picture of yourself, I forgive. But even if you forgive me, that would not mean that you will be healed immediately physically. Your physical healing will take time. Maybe it will not be completely healed. The scar may stay with you for life. In the same way, emotional scars may remain. But that does not necessarily mean that forgiveness has not been given. Thirdly, forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. One of our favorite Naga slogans is forgive and forget. Someone said this is one of the most stupid slogans in the English language. Forgive and forget. But why is it so stupid? Well, a number of reasons. Number one, we need to ask, who will do the forgetting? Will it be the victim who will do the forgetting? Or will it be the perpetrator? And who is calling for the forgetting? Perpetrators are more than willing to shout this slogan. Forgive and forget. Of course they will want that. Or is it the bystanders and the community around who are calling for that? Forgive and forget. We need to be very careful, because if we are too quick to shout this slogan, forgive and forget, it will only show us to be a community that does not take wrongdoing seriously. So we need to be careful. Another problem with the slogan forgive and forget is, if a wrong is forgotten, there's no need for it to be forgiven. It's forgotten. Let's move on. Why talk about forgiveness? Another problem with this is, it is impossible sometimes to forget serious wrongdoing. It is humanly impossible. And another problem is this: if wrongdoings are easily forgotten, then there's a danger that they will be repeated. And sometimes it is good for a community to remember its serious wrongdoings of the past, so that these wrongdoings are not repeated. So forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. Forgiveness also is not the same as condoning or excusing. What does it mean to condone something? To condone a wrong is to simply imply that the action was not really wrong. To condone a wrongdoing is to say, well, it doesn't matter. I didn't really mind. I didn't really mind. That is condoning. But forgiveness is not saying it doesn't matter. Forgiveness is not saying it is not wrong. So forgiveness is not condoning. And fifthly, forgiveness is not weakness. You know, it was the Prussian philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche who said that forgiveness is an ethic of weakness. It is only weak people who forgive. He was a great mind, but I think he was wrong here. But why is it wrong? Because ask yourself, is it easier for you to hate or to love? Which one is easier? I think it is easier to hate someone who has wronged you than to love that person. It takes more strength to love than to hate. It takes more strength to forgive than to take revenge. So forgiveness is not a sign of weakness. It is actually a sign of strength. Now, having looked at what forgiveness is not, let's very quickly look at what forgiveness is. Of course, I cannot say all that I want to say. But I want to begin by saying that forgiveness is an appropriate response to imperfect reality. That is the most simple definition that I can give of forgiveness. It is an appropriate response to imperfect reality. And as Christians, we believe that we live in a reality, the world, political arrangements. We live with other beings, human beings, and family members, and spouses, and friends, who are created good but fallen. We live in a good but fallen world. But this world is not just a fallen world, it is also a redeemed world. God has redeemed the world in Christ. But it is not yet a fully perfected world. So we live within these coordinates of good but fallen, fallen but redeemed, redeemed but not fully redeemed. We live in an imperfect world. And it is not just an imperfect world, it is an imperfectible world. Until, as Christians, we believe, until Jesus returns. So within this imperfect and imperfectible world, how do we live? Well, we can live in different ways. We can live with a lot of anger and resentment and hatred. That is one option. We can live with violence and war. That is another option. We can live striving towards perfection and condemning anything and everything that is imperfect. Or we can live with forgiveness. Realizing that the world is imperfect, that we are imperfect, that others are imperfect, that their actions would hurt us. But that we have no other choice than to be forgiving. So forgiveness is an appropriate response to imperfect reality. Forgiveness also involves truth and condemnation and judgment. When I forgive, if I were to walk up to you right now and tell you, I forgive you, you would immediately think, what have I done wrong? What did I do to you? In my very speech act, I forgive you. In my speech or my act of forgiving you, what am I doing? I am implying that you are a wrongdoer. You have done something wrong. So to say, I forgive you, is to name and judge an action as wrong. And it is to name and judge and condemn a person as a wrongdoer. So forgiveness it is not just excusing someone. Or it is not saying, oh, it's okay, what you did was not really wrong. No, what you did was wrong. That's why I'm saying, I forgive you. So forgiveness, it involves truth, judgment, condemnation. But forgiveness at the same time, it requires forbearance. What is forbearance? Forbearance requires restraint, self-control, tolerance, and especially restraint from taking revenge. Forgiveness also requires empathy. What is empathy? Empathy is basically the imaginative process of being sensitive to others, trying to understand the thoughts and the feelings and the experiences of others, including that of wrongdoers. It does not mean excusing them, but it also means taking their perspective into consideration. Empathy also means that we remember that everyone has weaknesses and that everyone, especially as Christians, is a sinner. We remember that everyone is a sinner in need of forgiveness before God, including us. So forgiveness requires empathy. And very quickly, forgiveness is open to or seeks reconciliation. Forgiveness, again, is not the same as reconciliation, but it is open to reconciliation. Again, reconciliation differs from context to context. If my wife and I, we have a tiff, or she runs away from home after that, and then we are reconciled, then that will look a certain way. My friend and I, after a fight or a betrayal, once we are reconciled, it will look different. Or a killer and a victim's family, once they are reconciled, it may look different from context to context. Now, having looked at the question of forgiveness very quickly, how can forgiveness be a political activity? And how can forgiveness have a purchase in, or how can it impact politics? First of all, it can impact the political world, or it can have political effect when individuals forgive. It does not happen often, but every now and again, personal acts of forgiveness by individuals impact the society at large in very powerful ways. In Northern Ireland, in 1987, there was a bomb blast, and this bomb was planted by the Irish Republican Army, IRA. And Northern Ireland, they've had a long history of war and conflict. So the IRA, they're underground. They planted a bomb, and then this bomb exploded and killed several people. Among the dead was a young woman by the name Mary. Immediately after her death, her father, Gordon Wilson, he forgave the IRA. And it made news, it made big news. So much so that that year, in her Christmas Day message, Queen Elizabeth II mentioned the story of Gordon Wilson and his act of forgiveness. And it really had a major political and social effect. Then there are other stories. On the other hand, there is one guy called Michael McGoldrick, who also forgave, and again it made big news. Every now and again, even in Nagaland, we have stories like that. Now, how does a personal act of forgiveness, how does it influence the larger political sphere? First of all, it can contribute to the healing of victims. I can honestly say, and I hope you don't mind my saying this, our family, by God's grace, we are to a large extent healed. And we have moved on. And our forgiveness of the perpetrators, we are glad that our Father did that, because it has healed us to a large extent by God's grace. So it contributes to healing, not just of individuals, but of the family, the community. Then personal acts of forgiveness can also create deep impressions in the psyche and the imagination of a people of the possibilities of human forgiveness. People can say, wow. And you are not doing it for the praises of men, but people, think, is that possible? Humanly possible? Personal acts of forgiveness in the face of horrendous evil can also point to a higher reality. It can also indict an apathetic and unforgiving society and community. And like I just said, it can stretch conceptions of what is humanly possible in the face of stark hatred and violence. And it can remind society again that violence and revenge and hatred can be transcended. So even simple private citizens, when they forgive in the face of violence, that is the way they can impact the larger community. It can also help in quietening down flaring tempers, because the community is angry. Their people are angry. But when the individual, the direct victims, or the intimates of the direct victims, when they forgive, they calm or bring down the tempers. And sometimes, people, they pull back from taking revenge. We have heard such stories even in Nagaland. Sometimes personal forgiveness can also result in repentance on the part of perpetrators. There's this story again in Northern Ireland of a police inspector who was shot dead by the nationalists. And his wife, her name was Florence Cobb. She wrote a letter to the killer who was arrested and convicted and imprisoned. She wrote a letter of forgiveness to him, saying, I forgive you. And this guy, the killer, he showed this letter that the woman, Florence Cobb, the widow of this man, who he had killed, he showed the letter that she had written to him to one of his prison inmates, who was also, who also belonged to the same group. And his friend was so touched by the letter that he invited her to come and see him in the prison. And Florence Cobb came, and later on they fell in love, and they got married. So, nothing too bad about that. Or, sometimes personal acts of forgiveness can also result in greater movements for peace. There are stories all over the world. In fact, a lot of peace work in the world and reconciliation work are started by people who have been deeply affected and who have chosen to go the path of forgiveness. I can give examples, but I won't. So, personal forgiveness by private citizens, that is the way they can impact the larger political world. Sometimes personal forgiveness by more prominent citizens and political actors can also make a lot of difference. Of course, in our time, the biggest and most glaring example is the example of Nelson Mandela. He was incarcerated, he was in prison, I think, for 27 years. And yet he chose to forgive. Even to the extent of inviting his white jailer to be an honored guest during his inauguration as President of South Africa in 1994. That made news. And we have no doubt to think that he was just doing it for political, we have no reason to think that he was just doing it for political mileage. Nelson Mandela. Even in Nagaland, there are stories like this. And actually, I got this from Morung Express, 2008. Morung Express, in 2008, Morung Express, they ran a news, which also came out in Outlook. Jamir meets Muiva in Delhi and chooses to forgive and forgives Muiwa. That's big. We won't get into the personal history of the two. And we are often cynical about our politicians, but I think we don't have to be always cynical about everything that they do. Or in 2008, again, Morung Express, CM Nipurio forgives. Yeah, again, very interesting. And both of these two people, former chief ministers, they faced assassination attempts. And they were forgiving those people. So, personal forgiveness by political actors. Then sometimes there can be forgiveness or public acts of forgiveness or apology by prominent public people. And this can be in the form of pastors or priests in Northern Ireland. I'm a little familiar with the case in Northern Ireland, so not that I'm Northern Irish or anything, but okay. But in pastors and priests, in 1994, the Archbishop of Canterbury, he went to Dublin, and on behalf of the English people and for all the centuries of atrocity, he apologized to the Irish people. And then, in 1995, the Cardinal of Ireland, the top Roman Catholic priest of Northern Ireland, he reciprocated by also apologizing on behalf of the Irish people. So, prominent people, priests and pastors can ask for forgiveness. Or, sometimes, and in the context of political conflicts, paramilitary groups can also ask for forgiveness. In 1995, one of the major political paramilitary groups or political groups, paramilitary groups in Northern Ireland, they apologized for all the suffering that they had caused on the people of Northern Ireland. In 2002, the Irish Republican Army, they also apologized for what they had done. Or closer to home, FNR, the work that they did. In 2009, these political groups, they signed a covenant of reconciliation. And part of the covenant reads, having been deeply convicted by God's call in Christ and the voice of the Naga people, we hereby solemnly commit before God to offer ourselves to Naga reconciliation and forgiveness based on the historical and political rights of the Nagas. We can resolve to continue to work together in the spirit of love, non-violence, peace and respect to resolve outstanding issues among us. Now, whether that actually happened or not, what transpired after that, we can be cynical sometimes. But I think that is a, good step. Or sometimes there can be peoples and groups who can apologize. In 2001, that happened. Again in Nagaland. All the tribes coming together and then apologizing and seeking forgiveness from one another. Or sometimes political authorities can also ask for forgiveness. In 1997, there's very sad story. In the border between Jordan and Israel, in a village, one Jordanian soldier, he went mad. And he went around shooting people and he shot dead 7 Israeli schoolgirls. And in response to that, the king of Jordan, he went to this Israeli village in the border, and then he visited each home and then knelt down and begged for forgiveness on behalf of this Jordanian soldier and on behalf of his people. So that is the way forgiveness can impact the political world. But as I conclude, or another one, 2008, Kevin Rudd, the Prime Minister of Australia, when Parliament opened, the first thing that he did was seek forgiveness from the natives of Australia for the so-called stolen generation of Australia. What I want to do as I conclude is very quickly, I want to revisit this idea or this concept of politics and look at the relation between forgiveness and politics. What is politics? We often say, we think we know, and we know what politics is. And we love politics, don't we, Nagas? But what is politics? Again, let's start by asking, what is politics not? Number one, politics is not just about elections. For us, Nagas, politics means elections. No, election is election. Politics is not election, or not just election. Number two, politics is not just a struggle for power. A struggle for power is a struggle for power. It is not necessarily politics. Thirdly, politics is not about lying and manipulation. Of course, a lot of politicians, they lie and manipulate. But when a politician lies, he's not being a politician, he's being a liar. And politics is not just about money or stealing. Of course, a lot of politicians, they steal. But when a politician steals, he's not being a politician, he's being a thief. So what is politics? And I end with this. I'll just take a few more minutes here. The first mention of politics, and the most famous mention of politics, is done by the great philosopher Aristotle. Very interesting. So let's go back to Aristotle. For Aristotle, politics is necessary in a certain polis, where there are different groups of people with different interests, and you have limited resources, and these groups are very different, diverse, but not just diverse, they have conflicting interests. And there are two options to resolve the conflict and differences. One option is go to war. Kill one another, winner take all. The other option is to do politics. And it's amazing. Do politics. And that is the original definition of politics. All the other definitions that we have are, side definitions. Politics is about living and interacting together in the midst of diversity and conflict without going to war. In Nagaland, we are so different, in many ways very similar, and we have our own interests and conflicting interests, limited resources. What do? We can either go to war and let the winning tribe take all, or let the political groups let them go to war and let the winner take all. Go to war, or the other one is do politics. And what does it mean to do politics? Politics is about dialogue and negotiation, not war. It is about giving and taking, listening to one another, empathy, forbearance. Even if you don't completely agree, you are listening and you are willing to negotiate. But I want to say, well, if that is what politics is, then it requires forgiveness. Whether you use the word or mention the word explicitly. Third, politics is about, again, like I just said, listening to one another, trying to work out something out of. It may not be the perfect solution that we want, but something practical, workable. Kind of a win-win situation. It is about sharing things and resources, and this requires forgiveness. Politics is about accepting that things are imperfect and imperfectible. But we have to do something together. We have to build a community. It won't be the perfect community, but the other options are worse. That is what politics is. But if we are to do that, then we need to be forgiving. And I want to suggest, as I close, that the work, even in the Indo-Naga conflict, or in the intra-Naga and inter-Naga conflicts, we have, by God's grace, and through the work even of, groups like FNR, we have moved from a position of war or a situation of war to a situation of negotiation and dialogue. And I think that's a good thing. Even at the Indo-Naga level, also. We may not be completely happy, but we have moved from war to politics. And I think that is a good thing. And I want to suggest that we would not have moved from war to politics without a measure of forgiveness. Forgiveness is necessary for politics. Thank you very much for your patient listening. And my time's up, my lecture's up.
I think he deserves a hand. Thank you very much, Dr. Kethoser. That was really enlightening. I mean, historically we have heard of war as politics by other means, but I've just now thought of forgiving or forgiveness as politics by other means. And how that becomes a basis for, I mean, we have heard of historical reconciliation processes all around the world, but often reconciliation and forgiveness, students of politics like us, we completely confuse it and we don't know how to place it. Thank you very much for placing it very simply, and I think I really want to attend some of your classes now to clarify that, and I'm sure most of us do. So quickly, I will not speak very much because I don't think I'm even equipped to go into analysis of this. So we will move into the discussion that we generally have after lectures like these. Quickly to tell you very basic rules, please introduce yourself when you stand up to speak. It could be question, comments. Please don't attack anybody personally. Keep your questions focused or comments focused, and let's have a nice discussion over the next 1 hour or so. Anybody can begin, unless you have some more comments. Just show me your hand and I'll pick you out from the crowd. Is that mic working? Great. Just give me 1 second. I'm just trying to get the mic working. Yeah. So there's somebody right here.
Hi sir, I am a student from St. John College, and I have a question for you today. Okay, sir, according to your explanation about forgiveness in politics, do you personally, or do you really think that in Nagaland, we really believe that there is forgiveness in politics? Or is there a scenario where really Naga can forgive for what has happened and reconcile maybe?
Okay,
Do you want to? I think this might work.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, thank you for your question. Please be seated. Yeah. The question is, in a scenario, let me just repeat. just to make sure that I understood. In a scenario like Nagaland, your first question is, in a scenario like Nagaland, is there really forgiveness in our politics? Yes and no. For me, well, let me just give you a story. I was doing an interview of one of the top leaders of one of the top political groups, or nationalist groups, somewhere. And we had this very long conversation. And throughout the lecture, throughout the interview, this leader was lecturing me. And he kept telling me again and again, Kethoser, you don't know politics. You don't know politics. Leave politics to us. But the irony was, this leader was simply refusing to dialogue and negotiate and talk with his or her enemies. And that made me wonder, you are telling me I don't know politics and you are the only one who knows politics, but you are not willing to do politics. So of course there are some people who are political leaders who refuse to do politics, if politics is defined as negotiation and dialogue and making compromises. On the other hand, we have, unfortunately or fortunately, some politicians who are willing to over-compromise, over-negotiate, and over-dialogue. So one day they are, very forgiving and with one group. The next day they have forgiven the other group, and so But forgiveness is not so much about making compromises as far as your integrity is concerned, but or your morality is concerned, but making compromises to seek what is the common good. So yes and no, that would be my response. Your second question is, after all that has happened, can we really forgive? Whether we talk about the Indo-Naga conflict or the inter-Naga conflict, that is your question. To that, my answer would be, what other options do we have? Do we go to war? Yes, that's an option. Do we take up arms and then take revenge? Yeah, that's an option. It might be worth exploring. Yeah. But we need to think about the options available for us and ask ourselves seriously, what do we do? It was Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt was one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. She wrote a book in the 50s called The Human Condition. Very difficult book. But she said that there are two faculties necessary for politics and for a society to move on. She said, two basic faculties. An amazing philosopher she was. And she said, one faculty is the faculty of promise, making promises. So unless we make promises to one another, we cannot move ahead into the future with trust. And to move ahead into the future, we need the faculty of promises. So that we can trust one another and move. So promising. The other faculty that is necessary for a society to move on is the faculty of forgiveness. And she said, unless we forgive one another for the wrongdoings of the past, we will be tied to the past forever and we will never be able to get ourselves unshackled from the burdens of the past. So promises to move into the future, forgiveness to move, as it were, away from the past that is tying us down. So yeah, it seems to me we don't have much of a choice. Yeah, thank you. Good question.
Yes, I could see Arian's hand, and then we'll take your question. Didn't you raise your hand?
No.
I always, whenever you do that, I think you must have a question. So I think Aniu has a question, and then we'll go to that side. Sorry, I didn't let you introduce yourself. Please introduce.
Thank you, Doctor. My name is Aniu. I'm a little naive when it comes to politics in Thailand. I'm still trying to understand it. But to my mind, I feel that it's actually the people, our people. The people who are not doing politics formally in that way, who really need to receive this forgiveness, So, what do you say about that? I mean, who does the forgiving, in this whole, in the context of Nagaland? Which party? Which party needs to do the forgiving, and who needs to receive the forgiveness?
That's a very important point. It is usually in interpersonal relationships, it is clear cut about who the victim is and who the victimizer is. But in long-standing histories of conflict, especially political conflict, from a distance we think these are the victimizers, these are the victims. But the closer you get to the conflict and the more you study the history, it becomes more and more difficult to disentangle things. And it is not very, as clear as we would like to be, or who the victim is and who the victimizer is, who the oppressor is and who the oppressed is. In any long-standing conflict, sooner or later, we find that we are all implicated in one way or another. And that we have forgivings to do, and we also have apologies to make. That we have been wronged, and that we have also wronged other people. So, even in a case like Nagaland, we need to be careful that we don't apportion blame just on one party, as if another party is completely innocent. It's a web, and unfortunately a very untidy, ugly web. Yeah. So I'll just leave it there. Yeah.
I think that calls for a longer discussion, a more private discussion perhaps. Yes, somebody there had a question.
Hello, sir. I'm Emily, and I'm a teacher here. First, let me congratulate on your wonderful lecture. And since now you are the expert, studying about forgiveness and politics, and you are pointing out so many incidents and this thing where people have seek for forgiveness, especially in Northern Ireland. So, in this course of this Indo-Naga conflict, have you come across any incident where any people on the side of the government of India, they have seek for forgiveness to the people of Nagaland for the atrocities that they have committed in our place?
Yeah. I mean, that's a very, very good question. I mean, and as far as I know, the answer to that would be no. If you are looking explicitly or if you are looking for the explicit use of the word forgiveness or apology, or that, as far as I know, the answer is no. Because, as far as I know, forgiveness, reconciliation is not part of the imagination or the political imagination of this great nation state called India, and maybe we need to inject that, and it needs to be part of their imagination. But there are, and I could be wrong here, but the way I interpret it, recognizing that the Naga issue is a political issue and not a military issue. Or willingness to not just, bomb us or burn our thing, but to dialogue. I think it is, these are faltering steps, but these are steps or policies that are, in my understanding, undergirded by operational forgiveness, even if the word forgiveness or apology is not explicitly used, and even if it is very imperfect. Yeah, but still, I would say there is, has to be a long way, or there still is a long way to go. And ideally, if it can acknowledge, if India can acknowledge its role, in the pain of the Nagas, then that would be ideal. And I think that would allay our anger a lot.
Yes, Dr. James.
My name is James, and I teach at OTS. Dr. Aniu, thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. I have a comment and question. My comment is, given the climate of politics here in Nagaland, or among the Naga people, both overground and underground, the paradigm of forgiveness has become really cheap, like it or not. And if they are doing politics at all, according to your definition, forgive me my blunt comment. My question is, as a Christian, because politics can be quite secular as well. What exactly, is there any relation between a Christian understanding of forgiveness and a secular understanding of forgiveness? Or is there any difference that you can help us understand?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. If I can just comment into your first comment, and you're absolutely right. The way you have put things. Part of our task is also to call our politicians to the very high and noble task that they have, and they have been called to as politicians. There's a great thinker. He just passed away recently in Scotland. His name is he's a political thinker and a theologian. His name is Duncan Forrester. Maybe you've heard his name too, the theologian. Duncan Forrester said that politicians are actually, their role is to be like pastors. Because the task of a politician and the call of a politician is to be a pastor. It is to build community. It is to hold together the community. Unfortunately, our politicians have abused that task, and they are more like sheep and wolves and whatever else. We are not thinking of anyone in particular, but part of our task, and if only they would live up to their ideal as politicians. Your second question is there a difference between the secular understanding of forgiveness and a Christian understanding? Yes, and no. It was Hannah Arendt again who said that Jesus was a discoverer of forgiveness in the political realm. So it is Christianity and Jesus which have brought forgiveness center stage, as it were, in human affairs. So for us Christians, we put a great deal of stake and premium and value to forgiveness, particularly because forgiveness is a major and a central motive in Christianity. And inevitably, it differs from secular conceptualizations. For example, even with other conceptions of forgiveness within Christianity, some look at forgiveness as conditional. If you don't repent, then you should not be forgiven. Unless there is justice, there is no forgiveness, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So there are differences. Yeah. A lot of differences. Yeah.
Is there an appropriate way to forgive or repent? For secular people from secular backgrounds, how do they? And here is a society that is from a Christian background, and here is a society from a secular background, and they need to reconcile. How do they?
Yeah. It may differ from context to context, but I've noticed that, the way a lot of celebrities apologize, especially on Twitter, on social media, is or they make a stupid comment or a racist comment or a sexist comment somewhere, and then they apologize. They will apologize by saying that, I'm sorry. For example, say, I'm sorry, but I did not really mean that. I did not really mean to say that. What I said, I did not really mean that. I'm not a racist, and my comment was not a racist comment. Well, then why are you sorry? We say we're sorry, we apologize, and then we justify our action. So I noticed that a lot of secular people, the way they apologize or they seek to be forgiven, they do it by justifying themselves. But forgiveness, to apologize is basically because what I did was wrong and it was stupid and I'm hurt and I'm sorry.
Yes.
Do I need to be the one responding always?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if there is anybody else here who would like to respond to these questions, this is just a discussion. We need not burden him with every answer, of course. If you know any experts here, please just point to them and ask them to speak.
She does a lot of forgiving at home.
We'll get to her in 5 minutes, exactly. So, who has...
Well, hi. Dr. Aniu, thank you so much. Congratulations on the completion of your book. And also, thank you so much for this lecture, giving us a glimpse of your work. And it's really fascinating to hear these connections between forgiveness and politics. I'm just thinking, you did say that it is interpersonal, right? Forgiveness is interpersonal. And I was wondering, though, in the course of your work, your research, did you come across any instances where sometimes it has just been intrapersonal, I'm thinking? Because, especially in cases where it is personal acts of forgiveness, not this big political platforms, I mean, lately we've had a few Japanese come here, and even in the Healing Garden recently, and saying words of forgiveness to forgive them, and that was really powerful, I think, on the bigger platform and representation. But when it comes to personal stories, I think it's even more difficult sometimes. So my question, I don't know if it's a question or I'm just wondering, is it always possible for two parties to meet in the work of forgiveness? Because I think forgiveness is not just about feelings, it's not just a one-time thing, I think it's a decision, a process.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll pick it up from where you left. Forgiveness is a process. And very often it is a very, especially with deep wounds and, horrendous wrongdoing, it is an incomplete process. That is why Jesus taught us to pray, forgive us our trespasses. We also need to pray, forgive us our unforgivenesses. Because many times we are not as forgiving as we ought to be, or the Lord would want us to be. But I've also learned to pray, forgive us our forgivenesses. Because sometimes our forgiveness itself is very imperfect. And that is why we need to ask God to forgive us our forgivenesses. So I'll pick it up. I picked it up from there. But to go back to your former point, when I say in interpersonal, I mean between two individuals. And personally, for me, I believe that forgiveness can happen without the two coming together. Always, if they can come together and meet, and then if once the process is completed, then I would call it reconciliation. But even without the two of them meeting, someone can forgive unilaterally. Maybe the other person has died, or maybe the other person is refusing to confess and repent. But the one person can forgive and move on, and forgiveness has taken place. Although reconciliation did not the ideal end or telos of forgiveness may not take place or may not have taken place. So it can happen. When I say intrapersonal, I mean something that happens entirely within a person. Yeah. And sometimes that can happen. There are times when we can't forgive ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, to take this discussion forward, Dr. Ellen, you work with, I think, intrapersonal forgiveness at a very professional level. Why don't you tell us a little bit about people who struggle with it? We will get back to the political angle soon, but we would like to know a little bit about the internal struggle of forgiveness.
Well, I'm just curious. And by the way, I used to watch Dr. Phil all the time.
Yeah, he's a wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes it's possible to happen intrapersonally.
Yeah.
Especially, I think now with that Olympian doctor recent case happening. I mean, it's still going on. Larry, right? Nasser.
Yeah.
So many women coming up for past 20, 30 years ago, decades ago, what he had committed and what he has done to them. And I think now the way women are coming up more and speaking out and the voice being heard, I think it's giving them more opportunities to do so. But I think there are many instances where I think many people have been hurt. And I think I see that as one of the what do I say, conditions of our people, even in Nagaland, when it comes to our situation, how hard it has been to forgive each other, because they haven't been able to work by themselves, intrapersonally.
Yeah.
And I think, I would say sometimes it happens intrapersonally also. And maybe there are some psychologists who go too much to the extent, and especially coming from an individualistic society, that can happen, I think.
Yeah.
But in a community-oriented society, I think the other drawback here is we focus so much on others. What will others say? Or the opinion of others for the sake of the community, that we often neglect that intrapersonal part.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, forgive me, I separated it from the political process. I just did not see the two coming together. But often I think because we cannot forgive ourselves, we do not find it in ourselves to be more forgiving towards the other, and then the whole political process of reconciliation doesn't even begin. So, is there another question or comment? Yes, you would like to make. It will come on in 2 seconds if you leave it on.
My name is Mulet Olivero. I work at listed a small company, a website company that we started. Well, I'm very deeply touched by your personal story and what you just shared, because I'm the daughter of an underground. My family have been a part of the movement since the 1950s, the early part, my grandparents, my parents, till now. And so my family history have been filled with a lot of conflict, and growing up it was not easy because then we have to hide our identities. There was the threat of kidnappings, and then we could see our parents only once or twice a year. And especially during the university and when I was working on my thesis, and especially at college, being abused because of who my father is and what he chose to do was very difficult for me to understand or to accept. And the simple fact was that I cannot choose where I'm born. I cannot choose who my father is. So, in a way, at the university, I was very deeply ashamed by the personal narratives and history that I represented and the site that I was born into. And so, it was very difficult, and recently I realized that I'm going to have the courage to apologize to people when I meet them, whichever side they represented, because it's very important. And also I personally believe that, like I have shared, forgiveness is very important. like forgiving ourselves, forgiving our families, forgiving our communities, and also having the courage to apologize, I'm sorry, because it was, like I was sharing, very difficult for me to accept that I am born into an underground family, and I didn't want to be, and I don't want to be a part of that. But then also having the courage and the wisdom to say I'm sorry. And so I've been meeting friends and telling them, like, whenever they share stories, because the story from the other side, I've been having the courage to say I'm sorry. I'm also from PEC, and I know about your grandfather and a little bit of history about it. So I want to say I'm sorry and I apologize for whatever happened to your family.
Hi, my name is Aniu. I'm not supposed to ask anything, but just wanted to say something. It's been a very charming lecture, and forgiveness and politics. Listening to you talk, I get a sense of feeling that what is implied is that forgiveness is the way to go about it. To bring the change or to create that thing. But I was just thinking about it, and I'm not satisfied with it. I feel like there's something more, and it is not simply enough. So, do you think there are essential ingredients along with forgiveness which should complement or supplement forgiveness, or which are more important than forgiveness in terms of reconciliation or improving the state of affairs in our politics and in our state?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm so sorry if I created the wrong impression that that forgiveness is the be all and all. For politics or in our situation. There are many other things that need to elements that need to come in, whether it is in the form of institutions or concepts or ideas, administration, so on and so forth. A lot of other things need to come together for a community to flourish and to thrive. Absolutely, absolutely. It's not just forgiveness. One very important thing that needs definitely to come in, and that's the title for another lecture, is justice. Because if we're just going to talk about forgiveness without justice, what happens to the whole question of justice when we're talking about forgiveness and reconciliation? We haven't touched that at all here. Maybe some other time, but justice, absolutely. Yeah, it's a big one. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
Hello, sir. I'm teaching in college. My name is I think Yogi. So I have read. Okay, so I have read some of your work, and when we're talking about justice, I think you have also gone beyond what the Rage have done. Like you have given a model, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, from forgiveness to reconciliation.
Yeah.
And the three, and I think the 4 ingredients.
Yeah.
Justice, mercy.
Yeah.
Truth, and peace.
And peace. Yeah.
So if you can kindly highlight more on that.
Okay.
And at the same time, like in the recent published book by Avino Kirie,
Okay.
the name of the book is, you must have read, The Power of Forgiveness,
Oh.
where she, in one story, where the protagonist was not able to come to terms because in a, like Elena said, in a community-oriented society,
Yeah.
instead of the victim forgiving the perpetrator, it is the father in that story, the father had forgiven the perpetrator.
Yeah.
So he had deep grudges for her father. So in such context, even in our context, we might have come across such situations where the victim is not the one who forgives, but it is the family or the community that forgives. So in such a situation, what are the implications?
Okay.
What are the consequences?
Oh yeah, that's a very important point. I'll start from where you ended again. Yeah, so it is not so much the victim, the direct victim who is forgiving, but the indirect victims, whether it is the father or the family members. So what do we do? Do you have a right to forgive when I am the one who is the direct victim? So now, that's a legitimate grievance to have, and a legitimate point to have if the victim is still alive. But there are cases, and in political conflict, there are cases when the direct victim is dead. So now people say you have no right to forgive, and yeah, they have a point. But I'm not. When my father says that he forgives these people, he is not saying I'm forgiving on behalf of my dead brother. He's saying I am forgiving you for killing my brother and in the process hurting me. So he's in one sense saying it on his, if there's such a thing as on his own behalf. And he's also, and there are times when the direct victims cannot dispense forgiveness, so the living victims will have to dispense forgiveness or give forgiveness. And to say that they cannot do that is ironically to say it is to withhold forgiveness on behalf of the victims. How do you know that they would not have forgiven? They could well have forgiven too. They might. So I mean, it's a tricky question, but it's a very good question. And I know I haven't been able to address it completely. When we are going to that thing, Akam is the expert when it comes to the John Paul Lederach. I mean, he's one of the great scholars and peace workers. He talks about justice, mercy, peace, and my memory is failing me. The truth, the four things. And when these four, and he took it from the book of Psalms. When these four things come together, then you have reconciliation. What I've done is I agreed with Lederach, but I've also argued that yes, when these four things come together, we have reconciliation. But I've tried to argue that it is forgiveness that animates these four things. And actually, unfortunately, in this edition of the book, the publishers have made a very major error with the whole framework. It should be forgiveness, animating justice, mercy, truth, and peace, and then coming down, it should be reconciliation. But they put forgiveness, and down here also they have put forgiveness. So it is very misleading. I've pointed it out to them, and they have promised that they will correct it in the next edition. Yeah.
So how can we access your book in any case?
I saw it on Amazon India, and it's so expensive. Yeah, I mean it went up. Maybe it's very good. I mean, it started with 1,500, and now it's 4,000 something. Yeah. So, well, what I'll do is I can order the book for anyone who is interested, and I get a good hefty author's discount. So almost 50%. And so if anyone is interested, I can sell it to you at 150%. I'll hike it up 50% and sell it to you. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. If you are interested, you can give your name to Ahiri, and then I can order it.
Yeah, sure. At the end of the lecture, anybody is welcome to place your orders, and it'll be a signed copy. So. Sell it for triple the price later.
Yeah, and I'll put my photo also.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
So, Madam Ono, I think, would you like to say some things about what's happening at home with the forgiveness? If you would like to comment later, you're most welcome to. Because I know this is like a two-way thing and...
Fine.
Okay. Right, do we have any more questions? Yes, of course, of course.
It's like in the context of again.
He'll just get you a mic.
Still trying to understand this
Sure.
whole thing. Yeah. But in the context of Nagaland and politics, I just feel that all the problems are so deep rooted that it's not just forgiveness, but someone or the other needs to sacrifice. So much, it's the reconciliation cannot happen, but everyone benefiting, like everyone involved, like it being good for everyone involved. Someone needs to step down, for the common good, or sacrifice power, and everyone's up to power, So I feel it's just
Yeah, absolutely.
I just feel that.
Absolutely.
That needs to happen. It's not just saying I'm sorry, but it's like, okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to step down, step aside, so that you can move forward and for the common good.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So it sounds to me like I've often heard the FNR say that reconciliation is a process, because FNRs often ask like, when will the society be reconciled?
Yeah.
And they often say reconciliation is a process. So it seems like forgiving is also a process, but
Yeah.
I mean, how far do we go with it? Say like, you gave the example of the Japanese professor who was here the other day, and he apologized to the Naga people for wrongs done by the Japanese armies in the Naga areas. Does that classify as political reconciliation, that the Nagas and Japanese are reconciled now? Or it's like a personal act of forgiveness?
Yeah.
Of course it's a personal act, but I mean...
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and we need to be careful. We need to be very careful, that we don't get into this whole cult and the drama of apology and forgiveness. We just need to be careful, because was that person sent by the Japanese government, or is he asking for personal forgiveness on behalf within his own capacity? We need to be very careful. When Kevin Rudd apologizes in the House of Representatives in Australia, yes, he has the right and he has the authority to represent Australia. So we just need to be very careful and be very sensitive. When our friend here apologized, she's doing it on her personal capacity and doing what she can, and we appreciate and thank her. Thank you for what. So we need to, Then again, is reconciliation a process or is it a state? Well, it depends on the context. Sometimes it is a state, we reach a state of reconciliation. Sometimes it is a process. So it depends on the context and what the situation exactly is. We can't just give it a definition in the abstract. Yeah.
We are still welcoming questions and comments, or anything you would like to add to anything you've said. Was that a hand?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. The thing that she said just now triggered something. In terms of saying sorry, and somebody has to step down. So, in terms of forgiveness, how important is the action that follows it? Do we need to make a sacrifice along with it, or is it simply enough to say, on a political level, is it simply enough to say, I'm sorry, somebody died in this process, but I'm going to come back in power or something like that?
Yeah. Even in the Bible, you remember the story of Zacchaeus and Jesus, and Zacchaeus was a shortish man, and he climbed a sycamore tree to watch Jesus come. And then Jesus invites him, and then in the process of sitting with, in the process of being with Jesus, Zacchaeus, he repents. But he also says that he would start a process of restitution. So it was not just repentance and then leaving it there. But forgiveness must be followed by, if possible, restitution. If possible. Sometimes it's not possible. But if possible, with restitution, or if not, at least with a change of course and a change of direction. Many times, or sometimes, some people, they apologize and then they continue with the same thing. I've heard of stories like that. I wouldn't get into it, even in our political circles. Okay, well, I'm sorry, and then you continue in the same course of action. Well, then you're not really sorry if you continue in the same course. Yeah. There has to be a change.
I just wanted to make a comment. I mean, we often think of forgiveness in terms of past actions, right?
Yeah.
But when we think of reconciliation, I know that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he talks about designing nonviolent movements against injustices with the final agenda of reconciliation towards all of society. So, I mean, how does forgiveness play a role in that sort of, non-violent campaigns to move forward? There's a problem in college. We have designed a non-violent campaign around it. But the point is not to bring down a teacher or a staff or the system, but to reconcile with the system and work together for eventual... does forgiveness play a role also in that sort of something that is happening later towards our future and not something in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I personally believe that there can be no true reconciliation without forgiveness. And the end or the goal or the telos of forgiveness is reconciliation. Of course, what exactly that reconciliation looks like will differ from context to context, but forgiveness is, forward-looking, and it looks forward to, or seeks to, or is open to, at least, reconciliation. That may happen or that may not happen, but that in an ideal world, yeah.
So if we don't have any more questions and comments, I really thank you so much, Dr. Kethoser. It was very enlightening, and so was the discussion.